Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, a librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. I'm excited for today's episode because it is our first interview. I talked with Mandy McGehee-Floyd, who just finished a research fellowship here at the Historical Society. She's also a PhD candidate in public history and a professor at Coastal Carolina University. She'll tell you more about her bio in just a minute, and she'll also talk more about today's topic, the South Carolina Regulators. They were a group of colonial settlers in the upcountry of South Carolina who wanted a more lawful community, though they were not always lawful themselves in their pursuit. But before we get too far into the episode, let's talk about some news. If you haven't heard already, admission to the Historical Society's museum is only $1 throughout the rest of 2024. The museum features galleries dedicated to the history of our state from its earliest people. You can visit our museum in the historic fireproof building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston. And in the archives, we have some newly processed collections that are now available to researchers. The first is the Winthrop family papers, which includes correspondence, legal papers, and genealogical materials for the Winthrop, Cannon, Webb, Fraser, and Parker families. The second is the Octavius Roy Cohen papers. Now, Cohen was a journalist, a lawyer, and an author of many detective novels published from the 1910s to the 1950s. This collection has his correspondence, advertising from his campaign for lieutenant governor, and some photographs. And lastly, we have the Strauss family business papers, which includes correspondence related to their businesses, like the general store opened by two brothers in Bennettsville in 1873 and a wholesale grocery business here in Charleston. Those are available to researchers right now in our reading room, which is located on the third floor of the College of Charleston's Addlestone Library at 205 Calhoun Street in Charleston. As I mentioned, we are talking today about the South Carolina Regulators with Mandy McGehee-Floyd, who just finished her research fellowship with the Historical Society. She also works here part-time in our reading room. She's a doctoral candidate in public history at Middle Tennessee State University as well. And she has been researching the Regulators, so we sat down to talk more about this group, whom she says is understudied. She has used many sources in her research, including primary sources housed in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, like the Evan Pugh papers and the Henry Lawrence papers. She also read many books, including The South Carolina Regulators by Richard Maxwell Brown, 96, The Struggle for the South Carolina Backcountry by Robert D. Bass, Unification of a Slave State by Rachel N. Klein, The Carolina Backcountry on the Eve of the Revolution by Charles Wood Mason, and Frontiers in the Colonial South by George Lloyd Johnson. Before we jump into the interview, let's set up a little bit of background on the South Carolina Regulators. They were a group of men who set up their homes and farms to the west of the main hub of Charleston, basically South Carolina's frontier. These men were unsatisfied with the level of law enforcement in their area, so they became vigilantes. But they also lobbied lawmakers at the state for more dedicated law enforcement. Now, there were a separate group of men in North Carolina called the North Carolina Regulators. They were a larger group, but these were two separate groups of people. So eventually, the South Carolina regulators did achieve their larger goal of a more formal law enforcement system in the backcountry of South Carolina, but in the meantime, they often took matters into their own hands. For the details, let's hear from Mandy. I'm here with Mandy McGehee-Floyd, who works with us at the Historical Society. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the regulators. She's going to tell you who they were. But before we get into that, Mandy, tell me a little bit about yourself and what jobs you have and why you've been researching these.
Well, I'm Mandy McGehee-Floyd. I'm from North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I'm born and raised in South Carolina. I have a bachelor's in history from Coastal Carolina University, a master's in interdisciplinary studies. And then I'm finishing up my PhD in public history. And while I'm doing that, I'm working for the South Carolina Historical Society as a research fellow. And I also work in the archives and library part-time. And one of the reasons that I wanted to research the South Carolina regulators is you don't hear a whole lot about them. There's not a lot of history that's out there. There's only a handful of books that actually gets in depth with them. And they were some really influential men during, before and during the Revolution, that really helped the American cause and, ended up in government positions in South Carolina, were influential in their communities once the revolution was over in South Carolina. And I just thought the movement was interesting. You hear a lot about the North Carolina regulators and the Battle of Alamance, but you don't hear much about the South Carolina regulators. And I think that's a history that people in South Carolina really need to know, especially particularly the men who were involved and who they became afterwards.
Well, let's talk a little bit about them. That word regulators, why were they given that title? What did that mean? What did they do, especially, pre-revolution?
Okay. Around 1760, you have the Cherokee War. Once the Cherokee were defeated and moved out of the backcountry of South Carolina. And when I say backcountry, I'm talking about 60 miles inland. So your frontier line is going to start around Florence, that area, and then go on into upstate. After the Cherokee War, the Cherokee are moved out of that backcountry area, and you get this influx of immigrants moving to that area. Charleston and many places on the coast, Georgetown, are already populated with wealthy planters. You have Charleston as the center of government, and you have people coming in, the second wave of immigrants who want to be landowners, plain and simple. So they look to the backcountry where there's lots of land, and they start settling there. That being said, being in the backcountry, there's no really law enforcement there. There's no semblance of government other than a few magistrates, justice of the peace. And the regulators are formed from mainly from landowners who own a lot of land. They're competing, trying to have that wealth that you have in Charleston. They want that for themselves in the backcountry, but they have all this lawlessness, no way to control people who are stealing, who are assaulting people. It doesn't even talk about women who are, of ill repute, so to speak. So regulators comes from this group of landowners who decide to take the law into their own hands, and they formed this vigilante group called themselves the regulators, similar to the regulators that you have in North Carolina. And they're mainly petitioning the governor, who is William Bull and Charles Montague at the time in Charleston. They want law enforcement in the backcountry. They want courts. If somebody did something wrong in 96 and they were apprehended, they'd have to bring them all the way to Charleston to go to trial and be put in jail. A lot of times, because they're so busy with the wealthy planters and any kind of business with government like that, it was neglected and they would be set free after a short time. So people in the backcountry, these men who were landowners in the backcountry, were very frustrated. They were losing property. They were being assaulted. One that comes to mind is James Mason, who we'll talk a little bit more about. He was actually a justice of the peace. I mean, the first record we have of him, he's listed as Esquire, which means he's a lawyer. And he's serving as justice of the peace. Well, these gang of men, these outlaws, kidnapping him in the middle of the night because he's trying to enforce laws around the backcountry and doesn't have any support. That's where that regulator movement came from. So they get together and they propose this list of grievances. They send them into the government in Charleston, which they eventually send over to Great Britain, and try to get some kind of government, some kind of law enforcement system set up in the backcountry.
You mentioned James Mason there and his, that he was a lawyer, so that there are some records of him. But what are some of the sources that you use? What are some of the ways that we know about these men and their activities?
We have newspapers, newspapers from that time period. That account of James Mason being kidnapped at his home and dragged by a horse back to town is actually in the newspaper. It's printed in the newspaper in 1768, I believe. We have journals. You have several men who kept journals. One was a Baptist minister named Evan Pugh. He was the minister of Welsh Neck area, in that area. He has a extensive diary. We actually have his original diary, and he notes regulator activity in his diary and as part of it. He actually loses his post at Welsh Neck and is sent to Castaway, a church, because of his involvement in the regulator movement.
How was this movement viewed by the men in Charleston, by the more, I guess, that first wave of elite planters?
No, they saw it as a contradictory movement, basically. I mean, you think about it, you're breaking the law to enforce the law. So I think the people in Charleston, from what I've read, felt these people were no better than the people they were trying to apprehend. And they weren't, and they weren't just arresting them and bringing them to Charleston. They were also inflicting punishment on them. And sometimes brutal punishment. There's a story of a man who was chained to a tree, and they give him 500 lashes, and they insult him, and they're playing drums and bagpipes while they're doing it. I mean, it's dramatic, I know. That's one account, but they're not just apprehending people and bringing them in to be tried in Charleston. In fact, they're not doing that at all. They're taking that into their own hands, and they're actually administering punishment to these people.
Something like that punishment might be the exception, but what were the general kinds of punishments that the regulators a lot of times laid out?
Be lashes, 50, 100, however many, depending on the crime. Even women were not immune to this. I mean, they would be included if they were caught doing something nefarious. They would be included in that punishment.
When we're talking about these men, did they just take this power and authority on for themselves? Did they just say, this is who I am now, and I'm the law around these parts?
Well, they gathered together. Obviously, they knew they had a need for law enforcement, and they pretty much they organized themselves similar to the military. I mean, have ranking officials like James Mason would have been one of the higher ranking officials. He was actually a major of militia, so that probably followed him to the regulator movement as well. They took it upon themselves to form this group.
So we've talked a little bit about this so far, but I really want to kind of zero in on the tension between the people in Charleston, the men in Charleston, and then the people of the backcountry. I know there was already a lot there because there's this sort of elite versus rural, even though some of them probably had just as much money as the people in Charleston did.
Well, they didn't have as much money for as long a time as the people in Charleston did. That was the difference. People in Charleston had their wealth had built up already. These people are, new to the area and just starting to build their wealth. And it's not quite where it is in Charleston. But you also have all of the government officials, these prominent men in Charleston who are in charge of everything. Obviously, you've got the provincial governors from who are appointed by Britain, like Montague and Bull. But then you have this ruling class of elites that are there as well, who are calling the shots, and it caused tension because they were ignoring the backcountry, basically, whether on purpose or just because they were so busy with their own lives. That's something that needs to be delved into a little bit more. I think it was probably some of that nativism coming in, and then even though they're coming from Europe, some of those class divisions still played true in the colonies. So that was probably part of it as well. You can see newspaper articles where regulators threatened to march in to Charleston peaceably now. It's not like North Carolina. We're talking about South Carolina. There are numbers of 4,000 reported in the newspaper are going to march to Charleston so that they can lobby for their circuit courts, for their law enforcement, for their government in the backcountry. And I don't know if the elites were scared of that, thinking that was going to be a revolt of some kind. I mean, you've already had little revolts here and there. So, yeah, that tension's going to be there.
You talked about women also getting lashes as punishments. What were some of the things that the women were punished for?
Well, if they were, loose women, so to speak, are known to be loose women getting paid for certain services, then yeah, they would be.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then you have women that would actually probably steal right along with the men.
Once, we come to that Revolutionary War period, I mean, some of these men who were regulators and who were sort of on the opposite side from the elite men in Charleston, they all end up fighting together as patriots during the American Revolution. How did that go? Tell me a little bit more about that. Was that an easy transition for them?
Well, they had Governor Montague agreed to what they called the Circuit Court Act in 1769, and that developed 7 districts in South Carolina, which included districts in the backcountry, and courthouses and jails were then commissioned and built. James Mason, again, was one of the people who was appointed to do that in the 96th district. So you had some resolution before the revolution even started. That being said, once things started going kind of south for relations between colonists and the British, you had people starting to take sides. So not only do you have the revolution coming about, but you also have this little underlying civil war playing out as well. A neighbor against neighbor, father against son, if you were a patriot or a loyalist. So, I know we keep going back to James Mason, but he's a super interesting figure in this, just because you see him in a lot of places and you don't hear anything about him. He's kind of overlooked as a major player, but he was responsible he was Major James Mason, and he led his troops into Fort Charlotte to seize British weapons and bring them back to 96. Well, one of the people that was with him was a man named Moses Kirkland, who was also a regulator. And he's there for that first initial seizure at Fort Charlotte. Once they get back to 96, Moses Kirkland says, wait a minute, I think I'm better off with the British. And he flips sides just that quick. And so now you've got people who are working together as regulators for the same cause against each other. And Kirkland actually led the British back to 96 to reclaim their cache of weapons and things and take them back to Fort Charlotte. And then you end up with that first battle of 96 in 1775 that ended in a stalemate. But, it was the first shots fired and the first bloodshed in South Carolina.
So there's so many nuances there. I mean, we're on one side for this issue, but on completely opposite sides for the next issue that comes up.
That happened. I mean, it was all through during the Revolution. People were, it's almost like whoever's winning are going to be on that side sometimes when you read about it. It's like, well, wasn't he on the other side earlier? Well, now he's on this side. But yeah, and, the longer the revolution went on, the less popular the British were. So, especially when they started having those tactics of brutality, Tarleton and his men burning houses and things like that, killing wounded soldiers and things like that.
Talking about the regulators, going back to them a little bit, we only know the names of about 118 of them, but there may have been, 3,000 total. So why do we only know those few names?
I think, and I'm not 100% positive, but from what I've read, what I think is that these 118 were major landowners, major slave owners in the backcountry. And I think that they were the wealthier of the men and probably had more pull. So they put their names on things more readily than anybody else did. And I think that's how they can identify those men.
If you could kind of sum up, we talked a little bit about your interest in the regulators, but why should people pay attention to them? Why should people know about them and try and learn about them a little bit more?
I think it's important to learn about them because they're integral in the formation of South Carolina, and particularly the upstate. If it wasn't for these men, we might have just had everything down in Charleston. Then we moved to Columbia as our capital. I think these men were the catalyst for that, for the state to grow and for people to be able to be planners in other spots in the state, to have that government extend to the back part of the state. I think these men are really important to the structure and the history of South Carolina in that aspect.
Well, and James Mason, you've said he actually has a buried in a place of honor.
He is. That's an interesting story. In 1939, he was buried. He and his wife, his third wife, were buried at his plantation, Glasgow Plantation. And in 1939, there's newspaper reports that he and his wife were removed from their original resting places and then reinterred at the Starfort National Battlefield in 96. And they're there now with markers and monuments.
Oh, cool. Okay, so we're wrapping up here. Final thoughts. Is there anything that I missed or anything that you want people to know about the regulators?
Regulators weren't just men who were landowners. There were also several ministers involved. I've already mentioned Evan Pugh, who we have his diary. Another one was Charles Wood Mason. He was a huge advocate for the regulators because when he was in Prince Frederick's Parish as an itinerant Anglican minister, he moved to the backcountry. When he got to the backcountry, he was appalled. Some of his descriptions of the people back there are just, they're almost comical how bad he thought the people were. He just thought they were savages and immoral and everything else in the backcountry. And he was all for bringing law enforcement and regulation to the backcountry. So he was a huge advocate for the regulators and wrote letters to prominent government officials for the regulators, the grievances, airing out the grievances. Oh, I think that's an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah. So, it sounds like South Carolina's Wild West.
It pretty much was. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right. You're welcome.
And that's a look at the South Carolina regulators, y'all, on the eve of and leading into the American Revolution. We'll see you next month with another edition of our 4th Regiment series, reading from and discussing the Order Book of the Regiment, which is basically a diary of the men who were fighting for America right here in Charleston. In the meantime, you can visit our archives on the 3rd floor of College of Charleston's Addlestone Library and visit our museum in the Fireproof Building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston. You can also find us online at schhistory.org and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We'll see you next time.